This video will provide a brief overview of Pennsylvania's ARP ESSER funding with the intention of helping LEAs understand the multiple buckets of ARP ESSER funding available. We'll start with the ARP Act, the American Rescue Plan Act, which was signed into law in March of 2021 as the third round of federal COVID-related stimulus. This legislation allocated $5 billion to Pennsylvania with a goal of helping schools prevent, prepare for, and respond to COVID-19. Under the ARP Act, in the allocation of ARP ESSER funds, there are several different buckets of funds allocated for very different purposes. Of the $5 billion in total ARP ESSER funds that Pennsylvania has, the ARP Act designated at least 90% of those funds to school districts and charter schools to use for the broad array of uses as articulated in the ARP Act. Of Pennsylvania's $5 billion share, that's $4.5 billion allocated in that big bucket. That means 10% of the funds, or about $500 million, are also sort of specifically allocated under the ARP Act. Of those dollars, 5% of the total needed to be allocated to address learning loss, 1% for after-school programs, 1% for summer enrichment, and the ARP Act allowed a state education agency, that's PDE in this case, to use up to 0.5% of the total allocation to administer the state's ARP ESSER program. To round out that 10%, that left 2.5% for other uses or discretionary uses. And today we're going to focus just on this collection of ARP ESSER funds that we're calling the set-aside fund. So these are $500 million in addition to the $4.5 billion, or that 90% that was allocated to school districts and charter schools. So we're going to start, as we talk about these set-aside funds, with talking about Act 24 of 2021. This is a state law passed by the General Assembly and signed into law on June 30th. And this is important because it allocated the $500 million in ARP ESSER set-aside funds. It allocated just about $250 million to address learning loss, about $50 million for summer enrichment, about $50 million for after-school activities, $135 million to other LEAs that were not school districts and charter schools, sort of receiving a portion of that 90% of the overall ARP ESSER funds, and $14 million for PDE to administer the ARP ESSER fund grants. This chart gives you a sense of which LEAs are eligible to receive a portion of funding under each of the 4 buckets that we're going to talk about. So you can see that those dollars allocated by Act 24 to learning loss, those for after-school programs, and those for summer enrichment, Act 24 designated those dollars for school districts and charter schools. Act 24 designated the $135 million from the ARP Act and ARP ESSER funds to go to a collection of other LEAs. So IUs, CTCs, APSs, PRRIs, chartered schools for the deaf and blind, schools designated as ATSI schools, and educational programs for neglected, delinquent, and at-risk youth are eligible under Act 24 to receive a share of that $135 million that was allocated. We're going to start with the first bucket. This is the bucket of nearly $250 million, and that it is targeted to address learning loss. Act 24 allocated these dollars for school districts and for charter schools, and the formula set forth in Act 24 to allocate these dollars is based on the LEA's share of Title 1A funds. The term for use of these dollars is from March 13th, 2020 through September 30th, 2024. And this time frame includes the additional year provided by the Tidings Amendment. Act 24 provided some specific timelines and deadlines, both for PDE to post the allocations for individual LEAs, as well as for LEAs to apply for those allocations. PDE was required or is required to post the LEA allocations within 60 days or by 60 days from the effective date, which was June 30th. So PDE has until August 30th to post the LEA allocations as well as an application. And from that date, school districts will then have 90 days to submit their applications, which will be done via e-grants. These dollars, again, are targeted to learning loss, and that means the implementation of evidence-based interventions really focused on addressing learning loss and looking to respond to academic, social, and emotional and mental health needs of students, really focused, again, on looking at those subgroups of students that may have been disproportionately impacted by COVID. In addition to those requirements, Act 24 provided some additional requirements for LEAs receiving and using these funds. Of their total allocation of that $250 million bucket for learning loss, each LEA will need to spend at least 30% of their allocation on social, emotional, and mental health supports, at least 10% of their allocation on professional development, technical assistance to teachers, to educators, support staff, school leaders, health professionals, to really help address the needs of the social, emotional, and mental health needs of students. And at least 8% of an LEA's allocation here must be used for reading support and improvement for students. We're going to move to the second bucket, and this is the nearly $50 million for summer enrichment programs. Act 24 designated these dollars for school districts and charter schools, and the formula for distribution, again, is based on the share of Title I-A funds. The term for use is the same as the prior bucket, March 2020 through September 30th, 2024. And the timelines and deadlines for posting allocations and for application submission apply to this bucket as well. PDE must post LEA allocations by August 30th, and school districts and charter schools have 90 days from that date to submit their applications, which again will be done via e-grants. These dollars have to be used for development, implementation of evidence-based summer enrichment programs, again, focusing on academic, social, and emotional needs of students, and again, focusing on those students that may have been most disproportionately impacted by COVID. The third bucket in Act 24 is targeted to comprehensive after-school programs. It's another nearly $50 million, and Act 24 designates these dollars again to school districts and charter schools. The formula for allocation in Act 24 is based on an LEA share of Title I-A funds. The term for use is the same, March 2020 through September 30th, 2024, and the same timelines and deadlines apply. PDE must post the LEA allocations by August 30th, and school districts and charter schools will then have 90 days from that date to submit their applications. Again, the requirement here is to use these dollars to build comprehensive after-school programs. These are evidence-based comprehensive after-school programs, again, focusing on academic, social, emotional needs of students and those disproportionately impacted by COVID. Moving on to the fourth bucket in the set-aside funds, it's $135 million is designated by Act 24 to other LEAs to use for any of the ARP ESSER allowable uses. The individual allocations are provided by LEA type in Act 24. It designates $43.5 million to IUs, $43.5 million to CTCs, $15 million to PRRIs, APSs, and chartered schools for the deaf and blind. It allocates $14 million for schools designated as ATSI schools, and $19.9 million for educational programs for delinquent, neglected, and at-risk youth. And Act 24 provides individual formulas to allocate those larger pots of LEA money by LEA type to individual LEAs within that bucket. So the $43.5 million to IUs will be allocated to individual IUs based on market value personal income aid ratio and ADMs. The $43.5 million allocated to CTCs will be allocated based on the share of each CTC's state CTE subsidy. The $15 million for PRRIs, APSs, and charter schools for the deaf and blind will be allocated based on their share of ADMs. The $14 million for schools designated as ATSI schools will be allocated based on economically disadvantaged enrollment, and the $19.9 million for educational programs for delinquent, neglected, and at-risk youth will be allocated based on Title I-D shares. The term for use for funds in this bucket of the set-aside funding is the same as the others. It's from March 2020 through September 30th, 2024. PDE has already posted these allocations. They're posted on the PDE website. They were posted on July 28th. And unlike the other three buckets we just talked about, there is no specific timeline, no specific deadline in Act 24 defining when PDE has to post these allocations, as well as when an LEA has to apply or submit an application. While the allocations are already posted, applications for these funds will be posted by August 15th. And again, these LEAs will be applying via eGrants. Again, these funds can be used for any of the ESSER allowable uses as articulated by the ARP Act. There is a broad array of uses there, and Act 24 does not provide any specific requirements in addition to that, other than a specific one that is limited just to intermediate unit use. For more information as we move forward, please check out the PDE website. We will be posting more information, more resources, and more guidance as we go. Thank you so much.